Good morning, everybody. Rev here. It is Thursday, February 17th. Glad you've joined me this morning. I hope you're safe and well and blessed and ready to be a witness for Christ. I'm reading from 1 Corinthians chapter 10, beginning with verse 1 this morning. For I do not want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers, that our forefathers were all under the cloud, and they all passed through the sea. They were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and the sea. They all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. Nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them. Their bodies were scattered over the desert. Now these things occurred as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in pagan revelry. We should not commit sexual immorality, as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 of them died. We should not test the Lord, as some of them did, and were killed by snakes. And do not grumble, as some of them did, and were killed by the destroying angel. These things happened to them as examples, and were written down as warnings for us, on whom the fulfillment of the ages comes. So if you think you are standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. No temptation has seized you except what is common to man, and God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear, but when you are tempted, He will also provide a way out so that you can stand up under it. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Here's a question. Do you learn from your mistakes? Somebody once said, if you don't learn from your mistakes, there's no sense in making them. There's a little story about a thief one time went into a bank in Los Angeles, and he said, don't give me cash. Put the money in my banking account. Paul here is dealing with an overconfident church. Their attitude was, we've been baptized. We're one with Christ. We eat and drink the sacrament, the body and blood of Christ. We're in Him. He's in us. Therefore, we're secure. And so Paul gives them this warning. He starts by giving them some history. And there's what better way to learn than from history? There was 5 blessings that he told them, reminded them of. One of them, they were led by the cloud. That's God's presence. 2, they passed through the Red Sea. They were delivered. 3, they were baptized into Moses and his leadership. You see, Moses was a type of Christ. 4, God's provision of food and water. Spiritual food, spiritual water means that it came from God. And 5, they had the presence of Christ, that is the rock that provided water, and is said to have been Christ, the source of energy, power, and provision. So what happened when Israel left Egypt? When you stop and think about it, it's a tragic story. 600,000 men, counting women and children, we're probably looking at about 2 million. They stepped out to follow God to the promised land. How many of them remained faithful? How many of them actually turned away from the fleshly desires of delicious food and drink and the body stimulations of Egypt? How many kept their focus on the promised land? How many remained steadfast and abounded in the works of the Lord until they reached the promised land? How many of them actually made it to the promised land? Well, 2. Joshua and Caleb. And you can read that story in Numbers 14. But why did this happen? Well, according to Paul, the answer is here in verse 6. He says, now these things occurred as examples to us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did. Israel's history shows us that people who enjoyed the greatest privileges of God were far from being safe from temptation. Special privilege is no guarantee whatsoever of security. Look at the sins that Paul singles out here. Idolatry. Now, we don't necessarily worship idols, but what do we devote our time to? What do we devote our energy to? Second was sexual immorality. One of the strongest forces in the universe is sex. And they committed adultery. That is sex outside of marriage, period. Neither party even has to be married. Sex outside of marriage is adultery. Only a passionate love of purity can save a person from impurity. The third one is don't test God. Now, oftentimes we think God expects too much of us, that we're missing out on something. And we think, well, it'll be all right. God will forgive me. But we forget that God isn't only loving, but he is also just. And the fourth sin is the grumbling. Many of us, too many of us, to our own peril, meet life with just moaning and groaning and griping and complaining instead of with happiness and joy. So what is it Paul's saying with all this? Heed this warning. These things happen to the Israelite believers, and they can happen to you. Learn from them. Don't get all smug with your Christianity. Don't get overconfident. If you do, you're just setting yourself up for a fall. Well, you might be asking, man, preacher, Rev, ain't you got any good news? Well, glad you asked, because yes, I do. Our God is a faithful God, and he won't let you be tempted beyond what you can stand. It is in his strength that you are delivered. There's a pastor tells a story about when his son was small, they would take walks together through a field. The neighboring pasture there behind the parsonage. And at first the little boy, he would just kind of hold on to his dad's little finger. But he found out that when he would step into a hoof print or stumbled over something, his grip would fail and he'd go down to the ground. Not giving it much thought, his mind on other matters, the pastor would stop and wait for the little boy to get up, brush himself off, and grab onto his little finger again. Needless to say, this occurred several times. Until one day, as the little boy was brushing himself off, he just looked up at his dad and he said, "Dad, I think if you would hold my hand, I wouldn't fall." And as the pastor tells the story, he gets tears in his eyes. And he says, he still stumbled many times after that, but he never hit the ground. My friends, as you walk along with God, don't try and hold on to him. Let him hold on to you. You'll stumble. You will stumble. Probably a lot. But God will never let you fall. Hallelujah. I'm Pastor Mark. I love you guys. Be safe, be well, be blessed, be strong. Go do something for Jesus. I'll see you tomorrow.